Good evening and welcome. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Foundations of the Union League of Philadelphia. It's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening in what I think will be a very, very special program. And now if you'll please rise and join Vice President for Foundations and Library, Ed Trzanski, in the singing of our national anthem, and remain standing for the invocation which will be offered also by Ed Trzanski.
Ladies and gentlemen, please let's sing together. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, o'er the ramparts we watched, were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Ronald Reagan was fond of saying, if you're lucky enough to be in this country, you're lucky enough. So let's keep our blessings in mind. Merciful and loving Father, we thank Thee for Thy gift of liberty, for the patriots who founded our republic, this most noble experiment in free human living the world has ever known, for those whose sacrifice preserved it through a ruinous civil war, for those who have defended her in armed conflict, for those who protect her this day from adversaries who would do her harm. Today, loving Father, we give Thee thanks for our Constitution and for the example of the two servants who provide us with the candor, intellect, and goodwill necessary to seek the greatest good for Thy people. Loving Father, bless these United States of America and the Union League of Philadelphia. Inspire and strengthen each of us so that we may comport ourselves in the public square in accordance with the angels of our better nature. We give thanks and ask for these blessings as we do all good things in Thy holy name. Amen.
Thank you, Ed. Again, good evening. On behalf of the Abraham Lincoln Foundation of the Union League of Philadelphia and Dr. Josephine Templeton, I thank you for being here. This program and the painting that we're about to see was inspired by the late Jack Templeton. And over the past 2 years, Jack's wife, Pina, dedicated herself to making this painting a reality. Unfortunately, Pina's been ill the past few weeks, and by doctor's orders, and she wanted to emphasize it's by doctor's orders, she's unable to be here. But Pina, I know that you're watching on live streaming, and I hope and trust that you'll be pleased with both the painting and with our program tonight. The theme for tonight is civility in politics. Civility in politics. It seems an almost quaint phrase. It seems so distant an idea in today's political environment that it must be one of those golden age fantasies that perhaps really never happened. But Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan were civil, and even more than that, they worked together and got things done. Fortunately, in our nation's history, civil discourse and friendly relationships among political adversaries is not unusual. However, we should not forget the times when our political debates turned into vicious personal attacks. Of course, the most uncivil time in our history was the Civil War. Civil discourse was rendered impossible, and 600,000 people died. The issue that caused this uncivil war was slavery. And in pre-war America, politicians, both pro and anti-slavery, North and South, leveled personal attacks that exceeded anything that we hear today. But you cannot find this uncivil dialogue in the speeches or writings of Abraham Lincoln. Yes, at the Union League, all things come back to Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was unambiguous in his belief that slavery was a moral, social, and political wrong, but he refused to portray anti-slavery advocates as morally superior to slavery's defenders. Lincoln's speeches are filled with preambles and phrases that set a tone of civility and fundamental equality between him and those that opposed him. Consider this 1859 quote, "We mean to remember that you, Southerners, are as good as we are, that there is no difference between us other than the difference of circumstances." This idea and acknowledgement that we have something in common with those with whom we disagree, the ability to see a fundamental goodness that is the same, is an essential element to being civil with each other. Lincoln knew this, and tonight we celebrate the fact that Reagan and O'Neill knew it as well. Tonight we're going to have a unique opportunity to get to know these two great men and their relationship from two people who knew them well, Mark Weinberg and Chris Matthews. Mark Weinberg is the author of Movie Nights with the Reagans. He served Reagan for 8 years in the White House as special assistant to the president and assistant press secretary, and as director of public affairs in former President Reagan's office. Weinberg currently is a communications consultant in New York. Chris Matthews was Speaker O'Neill's chief of staff for 6 years. He's the host of Hardball with Chris Matthews on CNBC and has authored numerous best-selling books, including Tip and the Gipper, When Politics Worked. Leading the discussion will be League member Michael Smerconish. Michael is a radio host, television presenter, and newspaper columnist. He broadcasts the Smerconish program. I knew I'd mess that up, Michael. Smerconish program on Sirius XM and hosts the CNN and CNN international program Smerconish. He is the author of numerous books, including his most recent, Clowns to the Left of Me, Jokers to the Right, American Life, and columns. Please welcome Michael Smerconish, Chris Matthews, and Mike Weinberg. Mark Weinberg, forgive me, Mark.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So, to our guests, each of you had unique relationships with the two that we're here to discuss and wrote a book about that relationship. Chris, the CliffsNote version of the origin of your relationship with Tip O'Neill.
Well, I work for him. And his daughter's here right now, Rosemary O'Neill, and she knows him better than I know. I was lucky to get a job with him, and he was in the midst of his fight with Reagan. And the thing you have to understand about this is that they really did disagree. Reagan was sort of a modern conservative, a Barry Goldwater conservative, and he believed in everything that he said. I really believe he's one of our great presidents. Liberals aren't supposed to say that, but he's one of the top 7 or 8 right now. I'm seeing the latest estimates of that. He's done very well in history. I think Speaker O'Neill is probably the greatest speaker, and maybe he and Rayburn. It's a tough one. And Pelosi's pretty damn good, too, to be honest with you. Very good. She's very disciplined, very tough. She's a Baltimore politician, really. I think that's what's great about it, that they disagreed. And they didn't just disagree on television. They get in the back room. I got to counsel them in the back room where they'd actually argue with each other with nobody else around. It was true disagreement. It's the best kind. It wasn't for show. It wasn't for scoring points. And they both were very patriotic in different ways. And I think my boss, cared about regular people. He wasn't some phony intellectual liberal, limousine liberal. He actually cared about regular people with regular problems, because for 50 years he looked out for people and their regular problems in the neighborhood. He knew people's real problems. It wasn't BS. It was real liberalism, of the best kind, I think. And Reagan had this whole philosophy, but they disagreed. But the best thing about it, and the reason I loved writing about them, is that when it came time to make a decision, they did, and they compromised, and they got things done. And whether it was saving Social Security, which was impossible, and they did it, they worked it out almost like a ransom kind of situation. You do this at a certain minute, and I'll do that at a certain minute, and we'll get this thing done. And they did the same thing on tax reform, and it had actually a really good immigration bill if they ever enforced it. It was a good one. It had enforcement in it. It also had amnesty in it, but it also had enforcement. It was a good compromise. And so they got things done. And when it came time to end the Cold War, this is the thing that would make you melt if you're emotional about politics. Speaker O'Neill went over to Moscow to meet Gorbachev before Reagan ever met him and said, we only have one president at a time. Deal with him. No separate deals with Congress. None of this stuff that Netanyahu does. We have separate deals with Congress. You have to deal with this guy. And he does want to reduce the number of nuclear weapons. Believe in him. That doesn't happen today. A leader of the opposition saying, trust our country in one person. O'Neill did that. Tip O'Neill did that. And it's all on the record. I'm so proud he knew how to put things together. And when you show the picture, I'll talk about the picture.
Great. Before we talk about the relationship from your perspective between Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, please educate the audience about the amazing job you had in your early 20s as a young press aide. What is it that you were doing Saturday nights with the Reagans?
Watching movies at Camp David. And that's my book, Movie Nights with the Reagans. I worked in the Reagan 1980 campaign and joined the White House staff after he won at the behest of Jim Brady, who was the president's press secretary, and I was assigned to go with President and Mrs. Reagan to Camp David on weekends. And every Friday and Saturday night, while they would invite a small group of people, less than 3 or 4, who were in attendance into their home, the cabin up there, and watch whatever movies they had selected, most of which were contemporary from the 80s, but some were golden oldies. I would add to what Chris is saying about Reagan, and I think Tip O'Neill as well, Speaker. I agree with you. He was the best speaker, and you don't hear that from a lot of Republicans either. But I will say that these two men, these two elderly Irish gentlemen, and believe me, that commonality did not hurt in the development of the relationship. But these were two men who came to Washington to do something. Reagan had been a 2-term governor of California. The Speaker had served his constituency in Massachusetts through his entire adult life. They did not come there to blow things up, to destroy a system, to turn the world on its head. They came there to do something. Now, they disagreed on what the proper role of the government should be in people's lives. They had very deep disagreements about that, especially during the day. But they were both committed to the idea of having government serve the people in some way, and that the institutions of the government, the Congress and the presidency, were good things and should be strengthened and preserved. And I think that's part of the reason that the relationship worked the way as well as it did.
Is it because they wanted to get things done? Was it that Irish bond that they had? What was the unity between them?
I think when they first met, the Speaker came back and said, I can't believe I like this guy so much. And he did like him because Reagan's a charmer. Reagan had all these jokes. I mean, I have a brother like this who has 1 million jokes. Speaker O'Neill had a bunch himself, I think. And some people can memorize thousands of jokes. And I think they're both good at that. Reagan was sort of a Hollywood Irishman. Excuse me here, I'll tell you what I mean by that. He used to speak with a brogue. Now, the Irish have been in this country, with the exception of like my grandmother from the northern. Most of us, my mother's side, are all the Shields, Conroys, Quinlans, and the O'Neills. We all came over here about 1845, okay? So we didn't just get off the boat. But we don't have brogues anymore, which is ridiculous. And in Hollywood, they always have the cop who's got the brogue. I mean, give me a break. It'd be like 1940, and the guy's got a brogue. He's 3rd generation. Reagan used to tell all his jokes with a brogue. Well, Speaker O'Neill told the neighborhood jokes, and they were Irish jokes, but they were like, you know, he had Murphy the Spy jokes. I know all these jokes. Somebody had to stop telling because they're politically incorrect. You had to change them. But they're still pretty funny. Anyway, I agree. I think the big thing was they're both in their 70s. And as I get that experience myself, I have to tell you, you want to get things done. There's no more putting it off. There's no more kicking the can down the road. You're only going to be Reagan knew he had 2 terms. The Speaker knew he, in his heart, probably he was going to quit in 1986. He knew he was going to leave. He actually knew just when to leave, which is a talent these days if you haven't figured it out yet. These guys that don't know when to walk off the stage, if you walk off at the right time, no problem. If you stick around 2 more years, you get in big trouble. And he instinctively knew it was time to leave and give it to Jim Wright. And I think that was one of his talents. Bob Brady just gave up his seat. I think this is a very smart thing to do in this city, and to know when your term is up. I think it was urgency. They had to save Social Security. They had to end the Cold War. They had to fix the tax system. They had to deal with it. Unfortunately, they passed a really good immigration bill, thanks to Simpson and Mazzoli. It was a good bill. And thanks to, out there in California, the farm owners, the big agricultural guys, would never enforce it because they wanted the cheap labor. Sorry, true. Big surprise, by the way.
I think another factor here was Nancy Reagan. She liked Tip O'Neill, and they had an interesting relationship. I went back in preparation for this and read her diary and President Reagan's diaries and what they said in private about them. And the speaker made a point of being particularly kind to her. Two things, and it stuck with her forever.
So right. You're so
One
right.
was that they had dinner at the White House, and he said, "I have never seen it looking so pretty," and that meant, or so beautiful, and that meant a lot to her because she took an awful lot of flack for how the White House was decorated. For the dishes, and for which the taxpayers did not pay.
I'll tell you a great story.
And
I got an insight on that because I wrote something for the speaker to use, taking a crack at Nancy, who before I became great friends with her, taking her crack at her over the dishes. And the speaker said, "No, never touch the family."
Right.
Ever. It's a funny line, and nobody ever forgets it. Don't ever do it. And he just put his foot down. Don't attack Nancy.
And that made a big difference. The fact that they got along certainly didn't hurt.
Very famously, after President Reagan was shot, it was Tip O'Neill bedside who recited the 23rd Psalm with him. Yeah. And I'm wondering how much of a factor religion was a bond between them. You and I talked earlier tonight about the fact that today in the Washington Post, there's a remarkable story by Karen Tumulty about a never-before-seen 4-page letter that Ronald Reagan writes to his father-in-law who's on his deathbed. And it really reveals the genuine nature of Reagan's faith. Might it have been faith that also brought them together?
I think so, and I think Reagan, as I mentioned to you before, the way Reagan's faith was sincere is because he never talked about it. And that moment that he had with Speaker O'Neill was a very private moment between, as Chris says, two 70-something men who were at a certain stage in their life, and it was a private moment that they shared, and it stayed with Reagan for the rest of his life. And he said, after the assassination attempt, "Whatever time I have left, I believe belongs to the Lord," and he meant that. And yes, I think it was between them a very private bond, never spoken of, but very much there.
Chris, what changed from the 1980s? Is it that those personalities are missing, or that the climate has been altered?
I just want to finish one more, because it's an amazing moment. When the president was at the Hilton, the Washington Hilton, and he was speaking to a labor crowd, and it was just a pretty good speech. You thought it was all right, and he wrote in his diary later. But he's coming out, and this guy, Hinckley, comes out of nowhere and starts shooting up the place, shooting at everybody. He shoots Jim Brady, shoots everybody, shoots a couple of Secret Service guys, a Washington Metropolitan policeman. And Jerry Parr, this fantastic Secret Service guy, the head of the detail, shoves Reagan into the back of the car, because you're supposed to do evacuate, cover and evacuate is the rules of Secret Service. Cover, don't fight the guy, cover and evacuate. Throws him on the back seat, jumps on top of him to cover. They buzz out of there. Reagan says, "Get off of me, Jerry. There's something wrong with me." He thought he had hurt him. And the pink foam starts coming out of Reagan's mouth, and Reagan realizes something's going on. So Jerry says, we're not going to Crown, we're going to GW University Hospital. They're there in 3 minutes. It's a long ride from the DuPont Circle. And they're in 3 minutes. Reagan comes in. He has half his blood supply is gone. Far worse than anybody thought. So he's upstairs to the hospital, and they're keeping everybody away from him, but Strom Thurmond sneaks in. Remember him? We called him Sperm Thurmond. He had kids in his 80s, and he was something else, his character. And Sperm got in there, and Reagan goes, and Mrs. Reagan goes crazy. Why? My husband's practically dead, and this old Southern guy's bothering him. And so she puts Jim Baker, fantastic chief of staff, maybe the best ever, to keep guard. He tells Max Friedersdorf, head of congressional relations, don't let anybody in the room, 24/7. You stay there, make sure no big shot talks their way in. And then after a day or two, not too many days, maybe 3 days, they decide, and this is what's so great about the old Reagan White House, because we were friends of each other's. I mean, Duberstein and I and all these people and Ari Weiss, we all knew each other and friends back and forth. And and he said, well, why don't we let Speaker O'Neill in first? First guy to see the president as a symbol of unity. Who thinks about that today? And he goes in, and he didn't know what, the speaker, I wasn't working with him yet, but he didn't know what a bad shape Reagan was in. He believed all the bulletins, that he's just wounded or something. Turns out the bullet was right near his heart. And he goes in to see, he realized that Reagan is really at death's door.
And he developed an infection.
Yeah, and
we never told
to the
anybody.
gurney, and he held Reagan's hand, and they did recite the 23rd Psalm together, the Lord is my shepherd. And I believe he kissed him on the forehead, believe it or not. All this is like human behavior, like your cousin or your brother or someone in your wife's family. I mean, this is the kind of thing people do among family members and close friends. And it was a magic moment.
Okay, so I come back to my question. I'll put it to
Yes.
you now. Is it that those personalities, we just lost John McCain. Is it that the personalities are gone, that the climate has changed, a combination of both?
Combination of both.
Explain.
The personalities are now much more personal about things. There's a mean-spirited and vicious tone on both sides of the aisle, that it's my way or the highway. There is a road rage-esque atmosphere on both sides of the aisle, which is unproductive and unhealthy, and you can see the results of it. I think Reagan and O'Neill were extraordinary personalities, but there are other extraordinary personalities. It's become mean-spirited to a personal extent, and nobody wants to solve any problems. They want, as Chris said, get the can down the road. And for some reason, compromise has become a dirty word. And Reagan felt if you could get 60% of what you wanted, then you could come back maybe and get the other 40%, but at least you could get 60%. And there was no better horse trader or compromiser or negotiator than Tip O'Neill. Reagan got that from having been governor, and that's why things got done. That's not how it is now.
Well, not lost on me is the fact that when Tip O'Neill was Speaker of the House and Ronald Reagan was a two-term president, 60% of the House and Senate were comprised of moderates.
Right.
And today, there are none. You can't compromise if you're only dealing with ideological opposites.
I think leadership's a word that's important. I know the current president has a good leadership record among his party, but in those days you had a liberal and a conservative who actually spoke for each point of view. And so when they cut a deal, it held. People, a liberal said, if Tip's for it, it's good for me. And a conservative said, if Reagan's for it, it's good for me. And so when it came time to end the Cold War, for example, the conservatives didn't complain about Reagan cutting a deal with Gorbachev because he's Mr. Conservative. They trusted him to be a leader. And I think when Tip cut a deal on Social Security, the Speaker, they trusted him to do a fair deal for the regular people. And leadership is important. It's these guys today and these women, I think they just, it's wet finger in the air and, check with your pollsters, and there's a lot of that stuff. We all know. By the way, everybody here knows everything we've said already. Didn't you know it all?
Okay, so
everybody
tell
here
us
know
something
everything
we don't
we've said.
know.
Is there anything new in this? What Mark and I have said, it's all obvious. We got a problem, and it's just real.
There seems to be this feeling that civility and success are mutually exclusive. And I would argue that they're not. That it's not an either-or proposition. It's not a yeah-but situation. Yeah, everybody's rude for each other, but we're getting things done. I think the example of the Reagan-O'Neill friendship is that you can be civil and still get things done and still disagree. That all of those things can exist, but progress can still be made.
By the way, Pennsylvania's had great leaders on the Republican side in very recent history, right? It's not like we're talking about a million years ago. Tom Ridge was fabulous, okay? Tom Ridge was great, and I think everybody knew that. And Bill Scranton was great, and Christy Whitman was great. There's a lot of people in fairly recent history that we all can agree with. And John McCain was fantastic. I mean, it's not a million years ago that I loved anchoring the funeral. It was just, there was something there that everybody knew was gone.
I lifted a line or two from your book that I use when I speak, not only in Philadelphia, but around the country on the subject of civility. I don't know if you'll remember the quote, but it's Ronald Reagan hosting Tip O'Neill at the White House. I want to say for Tip's 69th birthday, stop me if you know where I'm going. And he proposes an old Irish toast in which he says, Tip, if I had a ticket to heaven and you didn't have one too, I'd throw mine away and go to hell with you.
I think he did. And that was the afternoon where Duberstein, our buddy Ted Duberstein, the head of congressional and later chief of staff, where they're all sitting around. It was a rare moment, but it was a good year for Reagan. He was in a good mood, let's face it. He got everything he wanted that year. But he's sitting around. It was the speaker's birthday in the fall, and it was Reagan because a lot of him was the actor in the movie. You know, he was like, he'd say, "Bring in some champagne. We're gonna," you know, like the character, you know, and they would call, "Bring in some champagne. We're gonna have more party this afternoon." That really happened, because Duberstein told me about it afterwards. It really did happen. So,
What did you learn from the diaries? You looked at the diaries. You wanted to know how the Reagans reflected on Tip O'Neill. Anything that was illuminating?
That they genuinely liked Tip, and I believe it was Millie, the Reagans referred to her as Millie O'Neill, and
Yeah,
they liked them. They enjoyed their company. There was a sentence in Reagan's diary that said, "And a good time was had by all," which was the highest compliment that he could give for a social occasion, describing a dinner with the O'Neills. I wasn't surprised by that, because there were not two Ronald Reagans. What you saw was what you got, but it confirmed and it affirmed what was, as Chris said, what was obvious.
and that, again, a real cultural difference. Reagan was Hollywood, new money. Speaker O'Neill was neighborhood guy, and he always said about Mrs. O'Neill, she's never changed, in great tribute to her. I mean, the idea that they were regular people, never became aloof in any way. And the Reagans were this Hollywood nouveau riche, to be honest. So they were very different culturally, and yet they still clicked on the country's interest. Reagan came to Tip's goodbye party, and would give a very nice speech at the Reagan at the Hilton, where he'd been shot.
Yeah.
And Bob Hope was there. And in fact, I have a memorable moment. I was at one of these guys. Understand that you go into a restaurant or a hotel and they have the long urinals, all big row of them. You know, you don't talk to each other. You don't look down. You don't do anything. There's certain protocols. And there was Bob Hope, about 7 down from me, and he looked over at me, and he knew that I'd be telling this story today, because he's Bob Hope, and of course you're going to tell this story. Bob Hope, we shared a moment, you know. It's great, but that was a big deal. Reagan and Jerry Ford was another really a friend of the speaker. Jerry Ford, they were buddies, and those are the old days. Bob Michael was a friend of the speaker's and the Republican leader. They were actual friends. This is not for show. And Sil Conti, a liberal Republican from Massachusetts, they were actual friends, and they're the people they wanted to hang around with. They really did. And George Sr. was buddies with Rostenkowski. These are real relationships that I think are gone.
So Chris makes the observation that much of this is probably already known to the audience. I want to be forward-looking.
Okay.
This is going to be unveiled in a few minutes' time. How do we get the climate back? Possible, Mark?
Well, sure, it's possible. You never give up on America, and you never give up on people. You never give up on politics. I think events like these and memories of the great relationships, the way it could be, are worth insisting on, and the people we send to Washington to represent us. It doesn't have to be this way. And if we had more O'Neills and Reagans and Gorbachevs and things of that nature, I think we'd be much better off. We can disagree, but it does not have to take this tone.
You're a political student of history. Does the pendulum swing? I'm working hard to leave all current names that are in the headlines out of tonight's conversation. I'll simply say, does it come back?
Well, I think everybody, unfortunately, is starting to pick their friends based on their politics. My wife does that too now. It's starting to bother me. I mean, I know a lot of Republicans, my brothers, for example, are Republicans. I'm not going to draw the line on these guys, and we never talk politics and family stuff. We just don't. And I think friendship shouldn't be decided by political orientation. I think it's crazy. I think people, especially people who live in the burbs, they have different politics, and they just do. And I think part of it is stop polarizing in your own life, and stop hating. Stop hating. And try to figure out the other point of view. I try to figure out all the time why people voted for the current president. I try to understand it all the time, and I get it. I think I get it. But a lot of friends of mine don't want to get it. They go, "Oh, I don't understand that." Well, figure it out, buddy. And because you'll be a lot better American if you can figure it out. And I do think the pendulum's going to change. Just a fact. I'd like to see, I'm sort of a center-left. I know what I am. I'm center-left. I'm not kidding myself. I'm just around there, a little to the left of the center. And on a war, I'm against stupid wars, and I'm for voters, everybody getting to vote, I go rip when I hear people are being denied the right to vote by some gimmick. So I have a couple of things I really care about. But on other things, let's negotiate. That's why we have a number system. That's why 7 and 9. Well, how about 8? That's why the Arabs gave us this, you know. It's called numbers. We don't have to do it with Roman numerals. It's not complicated. 7, 5, pay 6. There are ways to compromise, and you can compromise on just about a lot of issues. Maybe not abortion, things like that, but a lot of issues you can actually compromise on. And even abortion will end up compromising on it. I think we have. But I think, what's my answer? I don't know the answer, Michael. I think if you hate, don't blame other people for hating.
Before we move on to the unveiling of the portrait, we knew them only through pictures, through illustrations, through the headlines. The two of you, you knew them up close and personal, and that's why we're privileged to have each of you here tonight. So share an anecdote or an observation. Tell us something that probably the public doesn't know about Ronald Reagan or Tip O'Neill. Mark, you go first.
Oh boy, well, I will talk about what you said regarding Karen Templeton.
Wait, if nothing comes to mind,
yes,
go with the Back to the Future story from your book.
about who's the first lady. Well, yeah, it's a funny story when they said who's the first. There was a scene in the movie Back to the Future, and you see on the marquee something of, you know, Ronald Reagan as President of the United States. Ronald Reagan, President of the United States. Well, then who's the first lady? Jane Wyman, and we're watching the movie in the Reagan's living room. And if you want to see oxygen, go out of a room and stone silence. And then who's the Secretary of the who's Secretary of State? Jack Benny and Jerry Lewis, the Secretary of the Treasury, and they enjoyed that very much. The thing I would say about Ronald Reagan is, the reason I hesitated at Michael's question, and I think he knows this, is with this particular person, there were not two Ronald Reagans. There wasn't a Reagan that you saw on TV and then would get in private and say, oh, that's what he's really like. What you saw was what you got, and it took me as a 20-something-year-old kid to get that at first, that I thought that, oh, well, you know, this is the Hollywood Reagan, he's out there, hey, how are you, what? Oh, no. But he was exactly who and what you thought. There was not one insincere bone in his body, and that was the great reveal to me that took a while, but he was who he was.
Tip O'Neill?
The Speaker hosts the President on State of the Union nights. He has a big ceremony office, H209, right off the House Speaker's lobby. And that's where the President has his green room. Whenever he gets, that's when, they always bring him there very early, because the dogs have to come in and sniff around all the chairs in the House to make sure there's no bombs. So he has to come early. And he comes early and he stays in this ceremony office of the Speaker. And that was really on it, because, of course, the Speaker was his political leader of the opposition. But I had this desk outside that office, and I couldn't resist, so I go in and see Reagan the first time that I'm up there. And I walked in to see him, and I said, Mr. President, welcome to the room where we plot against you. I am that way. And he goes, oh no, not after 6. The Speaker says we're all friends after 6. And it was true. It actually happened. He really did do it, and he meant it. And that's the story. He meant it.
May I just say in closing that I've read both of their books. I've interviewed both of them about their books. Movie Night with the Reagans, Tip and the Gipper, tremendous reads. Thank you, gentlemen. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mark Weinberg, Michael Smerconish, Chris Matthews, thank you very much. Gentlemen, thank you. That was really spectacular and enlightening. So now on to the next portion of our program. But before we get to the painting, I want to tell you a little bit about the Abraham Lincoln Foundation, and we're going to talk about something else that's important to us here at the Union League of Philadelphia. The Abraham Lincoln Foundation uses the history, collections, and spirit of the League to educate and inspires membership and the public. And a good place to start to understand this spirit of the League is with the first line of our bylaws. Should we all recite it together? Every member shall support the Constitution and the free enterprise system. That is our first line. And today is Constitution Day. It is the day that we recognize the adoption of the Constitution that took place 231 years ago today. And fittingly tonight, we call upon the individual who leads the only institution in America that was established by Congress to disseminate information about the United States Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. Those of us that know Jeff Rosen have heard that before, and we appreciate it. Please join me in welcoming Union League member and President and CEO of the National Constitution Center, Jeffrey Rosen.
Thank you so much, John, for reciting the National Constitution Center's mantra in such an inspiring way. And ladies and gentlemen, happy Constitution Day. It is a special honor to be here on Constitution Day to commemorate the unveiling of this portrait of Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan that meant so much to Jack Templeton. And I want to express special gratitude for including me to Heather Templeton Dill, to Jennifer Simpson, and to dear Pina Templeton, who is watching on live stream. Thank you for commissioning this portrait, and we all miss Jack so much. You've asked me to discuss an important question on Constitution Day. What would the founders make of the decline of civility in America today, and how can we resurrect it? And to answer that important question, I want to begin with one of Jack Templeton's favorite quotations from the founding era, and it's familiar, and it's from Benjamin Franklin. And when Franklin was asked what the framers had created, he replied, "A republic if you can keep it." And that line, which Jack urged all students and citizens to think about, provides an answer to the question of the decline of civility in America. Because the founders did not create a direct democracy. They meant to create a representative republic because they were afraid that direct democracy would unleash popular passion rather than reason that would lead to the rule of polarization and demagogues and the mob. James Madison came to Philadelphia in 1787 with Athens on his mind. He'd been reading 2 trunkfuls of books sent by Thomas Jefferson from Paris about the history of failed democracies, such as Athens and Rome. In particular, he was convinced that in Athens, the 6,000-person assembly had succumbed to rule by demagogues. He said in Federalist 54, "In all very large assemblies, of any number controlled, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob." Madison believed that face-to-face deliberation by passionate citizens would lead to the rise of factions, which he defined as any group, whether a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason, by self-interest rather than a devotion to private liberty and the public good. And that is why Madison and the fellow framers were so determined to create a representative republic which would cool popular passions by slowing down deliberation so that reason could prevail. That's the point of the constitutional system. The central idea is not the Bill of Rights, it's the structural protections that separate power among the 3 branches, ensuring that no branch can speak for we the people, that divides power between the federal government and the states, and that makes it impossible to rule by popular referenda, by Brexit vote, or Twitter polls. Ladies and gentlemen, as you've just heard so eloquently, all of the cooling mechanisms that the framers put in place are, in our polarized age, under siege. Congress, so movingly embodied in the Reagan-ONeill portrait, is no longer a place for Madisonian deliberation, but instead two red and blue armed camps. We are more polarized as a nation, according to objective measures, than in any time since the Civil War. And that polarization mostly reflects geographic and virtual self-sorting. Red and blue America live in different geographic areas, consume different social media, and as a result are unable to hear each other's point of view and respectfully deliberate and compromise. Michael Smerconish is absolutely right about the stats in Congress. In 1960, there was a 50% overlap between the most liberal Republican and conservative Democrat. Today, as Michael said, there is no overlap. That's the transformation of Congress. Then we have the transformation of the executive branch. I can say in a completely nonpartisan spirit that the spectacle of tweeting presidents, and Barack Obama was the first president to tweet, would have appalled James Madison. Because in Federalist 10, he said that direct appeals between the president and the people would lead to the rule of emotion and passion rather than cool deliberative reason. The presidency was transformed not in recent decades, but as early as 1912, when Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt insisted that the president was a steward of the people who would directly channel popular will, and the constitutionalist president, William Howard Taft, instead insisted the president owed his allegiance to the Constitution. And it was the rise of progressive era innovations like the direct primary and the direct election of senators and the popular initiative and referenda that transformed the office of the president into an imperial body that rules by executive order and fiat rather than according to constitutional limits. And then we have the transformation of the media, and this is such an important part of the story. We all know how these new platforms such as Twitter and Facebook have transformed our lives and our politics. And they represent a kind of Madisonian nightmare. If the whole point of the Madisonian system is to slow down deliberation, Madison thought that the extended size of the American Republic would make it impossible for mobs or factions to organize and discover each other, and by the time they did, then the passion would have petered out. Social Twitter and Facebook obviate the benefits of geographic dispersion. Madison hoped that a class of journalists he called the literati would use the new mass media to allow reason slowly to spread over the land. And the Federalist Papers were published in the newspapers. The first printing of the Constitution at the Constitution Center is in the Pennsylvania Packet newspaper. And Madison hoped that people would use complicated arguments to promote the spread of reason. Now we have Twitter polls, Brexit votes, and most importantly, it turns out that on social media, posts defined by passion are shared more widely and more quickly than those based on reason. And that's why fake news can spread more than real news, because people are more likely to share something if it has an inflammatory headline rather than taking the time to read and absorb it. What is the solution to this dramatic challenge to Madisonian ideals? Well, there are modest technological solutions. Facebook is experimenting with an algorithm that will put higher in the news feed posts that people actually read. Facebook can tell if you've read something or not. Creepy, but maybe useful from a Madisonian perspective. And if you share something without reading it, that'll be lower on in your friends' feeds than if you take the time to actually read it. A modest but useful innovation. But it is urgently important, fellow Union League members, for us to think hard as a society about how to resurrect Madisonian cooling mechanisms so that we can slow down deliberation. That was the Madisonian idea, that given time enough to deliberate, that reason could prevail. And I do believe that the most urgent and immediate solution to the problem is civic education. And that is a cause that Jack Templeton cared so much about. Madison and Washington and the framers are explicit about this. Jefferson says a democracy cannot survive ignorant and free. Washington says that it's especially important to educate citizens in the science of government. It's not enough just to be educated. It turns out that more highly educated people are even more polarized than those who have less high education. But those citizens who are educated in history and social studies, and in particular constitutional principles, are more likely to support an independent judiciary, more likely to oppose the overturning of judicial decisions by popular vote, and more likely to adhere to the principles of constitutional government. That is why it has been so meaningful that, because of Jack Templeton's vision, the National Constitution Center has created an online platform, the Interactive Constitution, that brings together the leading liberal and conservative scholars in America to debate every clause of the Constitution. And it's so exciting to take this platform to millions of America across the country. Today at the Constitution Center, we had 4,600 kids, and they were just, with their shining faces, clamoring in the building and learning and debating. And we launched today our first online exchanges. Using the Interactive Constitution, we were able to unite 600 kids in classrooms from Philadelphia to Kentucky and California to Ohio, and they were debating the meaning of the First Amendment using the Interactive Constitution. And it's an incredible model for what we can do to expand this amazing tool. We're creating videos with Supreme Court Justices Gorsuch and Kagan as a model for the kind of multi-partisan deliberation that this portrait embodies. And we believe, just as Jack did, that by bringing together citizens of different perspectives to debate not political views but constitutional views, we can unite around the structures that unite us, slow down deliberation, listen respectfully, and ultimately preserve liberty. It's an incredibly meaningful crusade, and it is so important that we spread this light across America because, as you can hear from Madison's fears, the future of the Republic depends on it. So that is my charge to you on Constitution Day. First of all, educate yourself about the Constitution. Pick a provision you didn't know about before and learn about its text and history and open yourself to the arguments on all sides. And then make yourself a missionary for constitutional education, and let us inspire people across the country to use these wonderful tools that are being created in the spirit of Jack Templeton and in the spirit of this conversation that we're here to have today. So that's why it's so important that this portrait is being unveiled to stand as a permanent emblem here in the Union League, next to Lincoln, of a time in American politics when people of different perspectives did come together. It's important for us to remember that it was the framers' hope and insistence that that kind of compromise would continue, and it is urgently necessary for us to spread the light of constitutional education so that the Republic can flourish and survive. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff. As I mentioned earlier, Pina, although she's not with us, hi Pina, I know she's watching, but she sent a note, and she wanted Kira Foley-Tusman, who is the Director of Development Administration for the Foundations of the Union League, to read that note. So please welcome Pina's friend, Kira. Kira.
I'm honored to deliver Pina's remarks on her behalf, so these are directly her words. My name is Pina Templeton. I am very sorry that I am unable to be with all of you tonight as we commemorate two great men and unveil a beautiful painting by my new friend and great artist, Renee Foulks. I wanted to take a moment to tell you about this painting. My husband, Jack, was a patriot. He loved his country and tried his best to live to the Union League's motto, love of country leads. For those of you who knew his politics, it will not come as a surprise that he was a great admirer of President Ronald Reagan. Some of you may be surprised that he also greatly admired Speaker Tip O'Neill. He admired both men because they believed that they were servants to their country, that what they did as congressman or as president was for the good of the country. Ultimately, for them, country came first. Political and personal victories were secondary. Jack was particularly moved by the story of the visit of Speaker O'Neill to President Reagan after the assassination attempt. For Jack, this moment of friendship and prayer was also one of patriotism. The attack on the president was also an attack on our nation. Jack wanted to commemorate this moment. Sadly, he died in May of 2015. He left a great legacy of generosity and patriotism, but he also left some projects undone. This was one of them. After he passed, I thought often about what I could do to commemorate this moment, both for Jack and our country. It was in part Chris Matthews' book, Tippin' the Gipper, that inspired me to make this idea a reality. I am very happy to see this dream of Jack's, and now mine, become a reality. And I appreciate all of you coming out to be part of it. There are many people that I need to thank who made this happen. First, I can't read that part. While there is Kira here at the League, there is also Tracy in my home office. Without Tracy, I don't know where I'd be on so much of my work, but especially this project. I also want to thank all of the participants in tonight's program: Grace Field, Ed Terzansky, Chris Matthews, Mark Weinberg, Michael Smirkanish, Jeff Rosen. I am very grateful for your help and your time. I also want to thank the people who helped to make the work of art a reality: Tom Pappas, David Brigham, Tom O'Neill, and the O'Neill family, and most especially the very talented Renee Foulks. Renee's dedication to her art and to this project was absolute. I think that you will all enjoy her painting, and I hope it is an inspiration to many others. Finally, I want to thank John Miko. John made this project a reality. He saw the vision and knew how much it meant to me, and to Jack, and to our country. Without his dedication, we would not be here today to celebrate this moment. I am not only grateful for his work, but his friendship. Thank you, John. I hope that you enjoy the evening and that you are as pleased as I am with the painting. Tonight is just the beginning for it. It will be on display here in the League House until January, and then travel to PAFA and hopefully other places, until my hope of its final home in the United States Capitol building. It is my hope that it will serve as a reminder of what our country must be if it is to continue to be the birthplace of freedom and liberty, not just for our nation, but for the world.
Thank you, Pina. There was one part that Kira left out. I'm going to read it. There are many people that I need to thank who made this happen. First, the wonderful Kira, who is always ready to make things happen. She is the one who really gets things done, and it is Kira, more than anyone else, who is responsible for making programs like tonight go on without any problems. And then, in parentheses, it says, Kira, you don't have to read that part if there are problems. So far, no problems, so I'm glad I read it. Thank you, Kira. Thank you, Pina. Okay, now for our unveiling. Can I ask Renee Foulks, our artist, to please join me up here, along with Pina's daughters, Heather and Jennifer, if you would join us, please, and Joan Carter. And ladies, if you would go over to the painting, except Renee, I'd like you to say a few words about the painting, okay?
Okay, well, everybody already knows what the painting is going to look like because Chris Matthews did a wonderful job describing what happened in the hospital room at George Washington University Hospital. But I will begin again and try to set a bit of a scene. This painting references an event that occurred 3 days after the 1981 shooting of President Reagan. Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, was the first outsider to visit Reagan in the hospital. Overcome by the seriousness of the situation, with Reagan basically being close to death, O'Neill, in tears, dropped to his knees, held the president's hand, and together the men recited the 23rd Psalm. So an intense and complex relationship began with prayer, and I had to begin in a similar manner. When I was asked if I was interested in developing this narrative, I wasn't certain whether I was the right person for the project. I'd like to relate a story that Pina wished me to tell. After I was asked, I went to church to pray before the Blessed Sacrament, and as Providence would have it, we actually were holding a Eucharistic day just at the right time. At one point, I mentally blurted out, "Lord, just tell me what to do." Then I returned home. Still uncertain, I opened my laptop knowing that I had to email my decision. Just then, my mate Sal turned on the television, and he called out for me to come quickly. So I rushed into the living room, and the TV was turned on to PBS. The series was The Presidents, and the show was specifically about Ronald Reagan, and the scene on the screen at the moment was a still photo of the 1981 shooting. So I had my answer. So I launched into the research. I read a number of books, beginning with Chris Matthews' Tip and the Gipper, also Paul Kengor's book, A Pope and a President, because I learned that Ronald Reagan considered St. Pope John Paul II his best friend. Tip O'Neill's Man of the House, and numerous excerpts and op-ed articles, including Tom O'Neill's Frenemies, A Love Story. A portrait is more than achieving a likeness, and a narrative can and should have many layers. So I needed to build a relationship with these men to sustain a conversation. I ended up working on the painting approximately 1,000 hours, so it was important for me to learn about Tip O'Neill's background, his Catholic faith, and his deep commitment to the role of government as an agent to bring about social justice. It struck me powerfully when I read Ronald Reagan's words, and I quote, "Perhaps having come so close to death made me feel I should do whatever I could in the years God had given me to reduce the threat of nuclear war." Their commitment to serve the nation and the world led me to title the painting Contract and Covenant. Both men recognized their duty as being sacred. Research also included multiple photo shoots, including one with Tom O'Neill in Boston. Tom's hands serve as his father's hands in the painting, and a session at Pennsylvania Hospital where I was able to stage a scene with 2 models in costume. Pina was not interested in depicting the machines in the room or the tubes running in and out of the president's body. Instead, she wished to focus upon their faith, their ability to cross the aisle, and the gratitude of these great men toward God. I decided to place us as participants at the foot of the bed. The thank yous are too many, and I will seek people over cocktails in a little bit, but for now, I would like to thank Dr. David Brigham and Clint Jukala of PAFA for recommending me for the project and offering assistance in so many ways. A thank you to Tom O'Neill for welcoming me to Boston and offering his time, and we're also so thrilled that Rosemary O'Neill can be with us here tonight. Thank you to John Miko and to so many folks here at the Union League who just kept things rolling. But my special gratitude goes to Pina and to Jack Templeton for an opportunity to be a part of their vision. Spending time with Pina has been one of the greatest joys on this journey, and I knew I was going to choke up. Pina is offering this painting to everyone, and all I can say is I just hope that everyone enjoys it. Thank you so much.
Do we do a drum roll? But at this moment, we will unveil the painting. Ladies, if you would. Thank you. Thank you, Renee. It's a wonderful work. Really looking forward to having it here at the League House for as long as we can have it here. Thank you. Thank you. And now I would like to introduce to you a woman who really needs no introduction at the Union League of Philadelphia, my boss, the chairman of the Abraham Lincoln Foundation, Joan Carter. Joan.
Good evening. On behalf of the Abraham Lincoln Foundation of the Union League of Philadelphia, I want to congratulate Renee. I mean, that is truly an astounding painting, and I echo John when he says we're going to be very happy to have it here as long as we can. I also want to express my gratitude to those who made tonight happen, particularly our distinguished panelists, Michael Smerconish, Chris Matthews, Mark Weinberg, and our keynote speaker who spoke up for the Constitution, Jeff Rosen. You've given us a night of good humor and of historic and thoughtful content. Thank you. And my thanks to all of you for being here. The program is presented by the Abraham Lincoln Foundation. We're a charity, and a charity that builds from the motto of the the first line of the bylaws of the Union League, that we support the Constitution and the free enterprise system. We have lots of programs, and I won't go through all of them. They're all listed, and I hope you will join us in some of the others. This program and all of the ALF's events are made possible by contributions from our members. And there is no member who is more generous than the benefactor who made tonight happen. And I don't know where she's watching from, but hi, Pina. She is one of the most generous, patriotic, and humble people that you've ever met. She's kind, and she's patient, and she's very, very smart, right? And she has grit, and she has determination. And we are so lucky because this painting is proof of all these qualities. So please join me in thanking our good friend and fellow Union League member, Pina Templeton. Thank you, Pina. And thank you all for being here, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
So a few final notes. First of all, this is not the end of this project. In fact, this is kind of just the next phase. As Joan and others have said, this is not the ultimate resting place for this painting. It is our determination, Pina's determination, that this will be, we hope, at the United States Capitol building in Washington, D.C. As you can imagine, that's an involved process. And we are going to need your help to do that. For the next few months, we'll be here in the League House on the first floor. We hope you'll come and see it down there. And then it'll be at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, probably early in 2019. And we will begin tomorrow, actually it's been happening for some months, to get the interest, the momentum, and the attention of our leadership in Washington about this painting and about this issue. So we look forward to your help. We will need your help, and we will reach out to you to know more about how you can help us get it there. So thank you for being here tonight. The evening is not open. There are drinks, compliment of our host, our hostess, Pina Templeton. Please stay for a drink, and please come up and see this magnificent painting. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you. Forgive me. Forgive me. Grace Field has arrived direct from Broadway. Is that correct, Grace? Yes, direct from Broadway. Pina's friend, Grace, will lead us in God Bless America. Please join her.
Hello, good evening. It is such an honor to be here. I will sing through the song first, and then if you could all join in a celebratory second rendition of God Bless America. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above. From the mountains to the prairies, to the oceans, white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home. Everybody. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with a light from above. From the mountains to the prairies, to the oceans, white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
Thank you very much, Grace. Enjoy the rest of your evening. God bless.